So Bill Bentenson is Butch Cassidy's grand-nephew. And so I was telling Bill, what do you want me to say? And I said, I don't want to spill the beans on, knock off your talk. And so his great-grandma was Butch's little sister. And Bill has ended up with all the paperwork from the family. Now, let me tell you, so Bill's going to go on for, well, we'll go, whatever he needs, an hour or so. But if there's questions you want to ask Bill, and hey, I've cornered him 2 or 3 times and had some pretty good questions to ask him that only a family member would know. But tomorrow, Bill is going to be one of the, on the side here, and those that came last year, we have breakouts. So each one of these speakers pretty much has their own little group, and they can talk Bigfoot, they can talk, the gold, the Rhodes mine, dowsing. I'm going to miss a bunch, as I always do. But Bill will be there tomorrow. You can have a one-on-one. He's selling his book. If you'd like him to autograph it, I'm sure he would do it. So Bill will be there tomorrow. So if you have any questions, jump on him tomorrow. Come on up, Bill.
All right. So can you hear me? All right. Very good. Well, I'm excited to be here. I think I've been talking to Kent for like 4 years and about coming, and it never worked out till this year. So I'm excited to be here. I got talked into going to over by the Skinwalker Ranch, and lo and behold, I saw some UFOs. So I'm a believer now. So that's kind of fun. As Mark mentioned, my great-grandma was Butch's little sister. So Butch was the oldest of 13 children. Lula Parker Betenson, my great-grandma, was the 9th of 13, but she outlived everybody. So she was the last surviving member of the family. And she wrote a book and was published by BYU Press in 1975 called Butch Cassidy, My Brother. I don't know, maybe you guys have a copy. So after about 20 years of research, I decided, never really intended to do a book, but decided I wanted to keep a record of what I'd found. And so I did my first book in 2012, and I just had the working title, Butch Cassidy, My Uncle, but the publisher liked it, and so that's the green book. And then during COVID, I did a book on his Wyoming years. That's Butch Cassidy, Wyoming years. So anyway, that's that. This is a picture of Lula. She was a pretty lady. She lived to be 96 years old, so I was 15 when she passed away. And my earliest memories as a kid are going to see the premiere of the movie. They found out when they were filming it in southern Utah that there was a living relative, a sibling that was still alive. So they sent some people over to her house in Circleville, and they wanted her to endorse the film. And she said, well, I won't do that unless I watch it and I like it, and then I will. So they had a little family premiere in Salt Lake City, and my parents, I was 4 years old at the time, 1969, they couldn't find a babysitter, so I got to go. And I remember sitting there watching the movie thinking this, at 4 years old, this was the coolest thing ever, just to watch them, robbing banks and whatnot. Of course, I always like to tell this, the power of pornography. The part that I remember is when Sundance is having Etta undress. At 4 years old, I remember that. So anyway, what does that tell you? Anyway, she loved the movie. She did not agree with the ending. She didn't believe that her brother was killed in South America. And she said, I think she saw it 9 times or so in her lifetime. And she said, I couldn't have watched it more than 1 time if I really believed that's what happened to my brother. But I'm going to talk about that in more detail. This is I don't know if you can see the TV very well, but these are Butch's parents, Max and Annie Parker. So they both came as Mormon pioneers when they were just little kids. Maximilian, or Max, was 11 years old, and his family joined the church in England, and they were in the second handcart company that came across the plains. And then his mother, you can tell, has that square jaw that he definitely favors his mother's looks. Her name was Ann Gillis, and they were originally from Scotland. And they came in a wagon train, and always had heard that they were with the Martin and Willie handcarts that got caught in Wyoming for the early storms. But as you research, you tend to find not everything's what you thought it was. But they apparently were so far on the trail and then got crosswise with the captain and got sent back, and then came across the next year. So might have saved their lives, because there was many that died during that early winter. Anyway, they settled originally down in Beaver, Utah, and Max and Annie were married in the endowment house in Salt Lake City. The Salt Lake Temple wasn't done yet, and then settled there in Beaver. And Butch lived his first 13 years in Beaver, and this is a picture of the house that they lived in Beaver. I don't know if you can see it very well, but unfortunately it was torn down in the 80s, so it's not there anymore. But in 1879, Maximilian was delivering the mail, and he had gone over the Tusher Mountains, and he saw Circle Valley and really liked that. And there were several families, I guess, that decided to move from Beaver over to Circleville, and so they made that move. And this is the cabin. You've probably seen it or stopped if you've been over on 89. That's the Parker family home, or they call it the Butch Cassidy boyhood home. They actually took them a while to establish this ranch. They initially settled on some land north of town in Circleville and Circle Valley, and then lost that. And then they actually, Maximilian put $5,000 down on the Jim Marshall Ranch, which is a little bit north of Panguitch, and ended up losing that, and then eventually is able to homestead the 160 acres that are south of town. And so this is the cabin that they lived in. The boys slept in the attic upstairs during the wintertime. In the summer, they'd sleep outside. And then this picture shown looking north, there was actually a lean-to that was built on that side of the building where the girls slept and where the kitchen was and that. But anyway, a few years ago, the state actually finally decided they were going to recognize an outlaw, because I think it is quite a draw for people. They see a lot of visitors, and so they actually, the cabin was about to fall over. It was leaning, and so they hired a contractor to number the logs. They took it down to the foundation, build a solid foundation, then rebuild it. So it's now open as a state historic site. So I was very happy to see that preserved. So Butch lives there the next 5 years, and he's hired out to a lot of, it's a big family, and he was hired out to local ranches to earn extra money for the family, and so he wasn't around a whole lot. But he was working down at the Marshall Ranch and got to know a character named Mike Cassidy that was a small-time rustler, and he gave him his first gun, and there was a little bit of rustling going on the side, and he got involved in that. And apparently there were two men that were married and had families, and they had been involved in this rustling, and they talked Butch into taking the blame for those stolen cattle, and that was his excuse to leave home. He could see that working on this ranch, long hard days and not really anything to show for it, there wasn't a lot of future, and he wanted to go see the world and make his mark in the world. So he decides to leave at 18. So that would have been about the spring of 1884. And here's a picture of the Parkers in 1895. And this is Lula's copy. And I think she was maybe tending to her little brother that's in the buggy, because back then, this is a glass plate. You had to hold still for several seconds for the exposure, and she moved and her face was blurred, so she scratched her face out on this copy, which is kind of fun. But on the back, it has all their names, and then also the name of the horse and the dog too. They were important members of the family too. So 1895, any guesses out there on where, if Butch isn't in the photograph, where he was at in 1895? Any thoughts? He was up in Wyoming at the state pen, so he wasn't available to get his photo taken. So anyway, and also Maximilian is off working, so it has Annie and then several of the children there. So Butch decides to leave. He goes with a couple boys from Circleville, and they head east. And Telluride was kind of the big draw for the cowboys in that area because it was an exciting mining town. There was a lot going on, and so they go over into the Telluride area, and he starts working on a ranch called the Spectacle Ranch, and he meets another Mormon cowboy named Matt Warner and Matt's older brother-in-law named Tom McCarty. In that winter of 88, 89, he's apparently they're a little bit bored, and so they decide they're going to rob the Telluride Bank the next spring, and so they plan the robbery. And in June of 1889, they go in and rob the bank. They had paid the Jim Clark, the sheriff, to be out of town during the robbery, and he got a little share. They hid in a hollowed out log, and so they were successfully able to elude the posse. They went over down towards Cortez and then over to Moab, crossed the Colorado River, and then headed north into Wyoming. So at that point, he changes his name to George Cassidy. He takes the Cassidy name to kind of honor that small-time outlaw that had given him his first gun, Mike Cassidy. And back then they didn't have fingerprints and whatnot, so you just had to change your name and you had a new identity. So he's now George Cassidy. And he makes friends with, we don't know exactly who Al Hayner or Albert Hayner is. This is actually his signature from his trial documents, and his partner Albert Hayner. And anyway, they head up into the Du Bois area of Wyoming, and they help the individual that's standing in the doorway of the cabin is Huey Eweman, and they help him build this cabin. The interesting thing is, during this time, there's a soon-to-be famous author that comes out from Pennsylvania to hunt elk in the area, and his name is Owen Wister, and he later wrote The Virginian, which was a very famous Western that sold a lot of copies and made him a lot of money and made him quite famous. But this photograph has actually been around for a long time, but Larry Pointer used it in his book In Search of Butch Cassidy, but you couldn't really see any detail. I was fortunately able to get a high resolution, and we're able to blow it up, and it appears to me that Butch is actually sitting just next to the door, and sitting next to him was likely Al Hayner, his partner. So here's a little bit closer picture of him, and I don't know how well you can see with the sun and that, but it appears that he's got a sandy beard, but in comparison, let's see if I have in comparison to the mugshot, the eyes and the nose, looks like the nose got scratched on the negative or on the photograph, but hairline and everything matches. I know some people don't think it's him, but I do. When I first saw this, I had the hair on the back of my neck just stand up. I thought it was him for sure. So anyway, then Owen Wister, during this time, he keeps a detailed journal of his visits, and he talks about playing cards with the local boys, and I think, well, that's kind of neat that Butch played cards with Owen Wister. He also talked about two not outlaws, but two cowboys that took another cowboy that got hurt, and he names them as Bob and Al. Took him over to Lander to see the doctor because he had broken his leg. But you know, it's a possibility he was talking about Bob Parker, Robert Parker, which was Butch's real name, and Al Hayner. Anyway, so he spends the winter there in Du Bois area. The next spring, he goes over into the hole-in-the-wall country and ends up over in Buffalo, Wyoming. And the reason they head over there is there's county fairs going on and the horse racers are going on. And he's got a good friend now named Manuel Armento that's got a fast horse that's in the races. And so you know, that's the fun thing to do at that time. That was the hot rods of the time. Anyway, so they go to the races there at the county fair in Buffalo, and then also up in Sheridan. And anyway, the hotel register for the Occidental Hotel that's there in Buffalo, they actually have those originals, and I went through those, and there was at least a dozen signatures of George L. Cassidy from Lander, Wyoming, that he'd stayed at the Occidental, which was kind of fun. So after that, then he heads over into the Bighorn Basin and starts working for the M-Bar Cattle Ranch, and that's owned by an individual named J.L. Torrey. And something happened at some point, but they became enemies. They hated each other, and J.L. Torrey went out of his way to try and put Butch out, get him arrested and sent to prison and get him out of the picture. So in the fall of 1891, Butch and Al Hayner are over at Mail Camp, which is a roadhouse at the base of the Owl Creek Mountains in the Bighorn Basin, and they purchased 3 horses from a friend of his named Billy Nutcher. And immediately they're wanted for these 3 horses. Now Billy, he swears that they're legit, they're not stolen. He gives them a receipt, but they're already, the law is after them. And the reason for that is there was a big, you guys have all heard of the Johnson County War that was happening in Johnson County, but with that there was also a huge horse thief war going on. And what the outlaws were doing is they'd steal horses in Montana, take them to Nebraska, sell them, and then they'd steal horses from Nebraska and take them back to Montana and sell them, and different places like that. And there was a big ring going on, and Jackson Hole was kind of the area where they were hiding out. And so after he purchases these 3 horses, they head over into Star Valley by Jackson Hole. One of the guys that was kind of leading the posse is John Chapman, and he had lost a number of horses. He's a rancher up by Cody, Wyoming, and he volunteers to chase the outlaws. And so they go to, so back then Wyoming has only 5 counties, and they basically split from the top from Montana down to the bottom of the state. There was 5 different counties, and so Uinta County runs the entire length of the state, and so and Evanston is the county seat. They go to Evanston, and they get with John Ward, the sheriff there. That's the sheriff for the county, and he volunteers his deputy named Bob Calverley to go with the posse to chase them. And Bob Calverley had worked for the Carter Cattle Company. Now, John Carter was the guy at Fort Bridger, and he was the one that kept the store and whatnot, and he had a big herd of cattle and whatnot. And Bob Calverley was the foreman for Carter, and there's stories that Butch had worked for the Carter Cattle Company for a time, and so they knew each other. And there may have been some bad blood there, but anyway, this is a picture of Bob. So they determined where they're at in Star Valley in the late 1891 December, but the snow is so high that the passes are impassable. So they have to wait till the next spring to go in and arrest them. And so in April, when the passes are finally clear, they go into Star Valley and make the arrest. So they go in and they arrest Al Hainer without any incident. Butch is a little more resistant. He's asleep in the cabin, and they call him out, say, we got a warrant for your arrest, and he comes out, but he says, you're not going to arrest me, let's get to fighting. And they both pull, Bob Cavalry pulls his pistol out, and Butch pulls his out, and they start shooting. And they're fairly close to each other, but there's also another deputy that's in between them trying to, I don't know, fight or whatnot, and there's a big scuffle going on. Bob Cavalry's pistol misfires on the first 3 shots, and the 4th shot finally combusts, and it hits Butch in the forehead and knocks him out, and then they have him. But I've since been able to research what gun that Bob Cavalry had, and it's a Colt double action 1878. And if you take one of those, the cylinder on those never locks in like the 1873, the famous single action army gun that was, the Peacemaker. That cylinder moves, and so I think during the scuffle it would have got off center, and so it would have misfired. So I would not buy one of those guns. Not very reliable. I don't think Colt had quite figured out the double action yet. Anyway, at the same time is the Johnson County War, where the invaders from Texas come into Buffalo, and in KC they kill Nate Champion and Nick Ray. And later on, there's a coroner's inquest done for Nate Champion, and they mentioned that there was another posse going to Star Valley to arrest some of the cowboys. So there's a good chance that Butch was on the invaders list of people that were going to be exterminated. But that list, once the invaders got arrested, it disappeared, and so we don't know for sure who was on that list. But anyway, so he's arrested, he's taken to Evanston, and the 2 of them are held for about a month, and then eventually, because the horses were stolen in Fremont County, they're taken to Lander, which is the county seat, and held there for trial. And so they are tried for the first horse. They're both found not guilty, but before the verdict comes in, they rearrest them for the second horse to retry them. That way it's not double jeopardy. So apparently, if that hadn't worked out, then they had a third horse in reserve to try a third trial. But anyway, they're acquitted on the first trial, and this is, I mentioned that. The second trial, Al Hainer's found not guilty, and Butch is found guilty, and he's sentenced to 2 years hard labor in the state prison in Laramie, Wyoming. Al Hainer, I don't know if there was some question, maybe he had given some inside information to get Butch arrested, because later on he is arrested again with another one of Butch's friends, and again he's acquitted and the partners found guilty. But Al, in order to kind of protect his, there's an outburst, and he's given like 30 days stay in the local jail. So I don't know if he's trying to cover his tracks or what. Anyway, Butch is taken by stagecoach down to Rollins, and then over by train to Laramie to the prison. And this mugshot, this famous mugshot was, so back then when they processed prisoners, they would actually shave their heads, and if you notice from his mugshot, he has hair. So I've always wondered about that, but I was able to find in the newspapers that they, at the time, were not taking photographs of each prisoner as they were processed. That was they'd had a number of escape attempts, and so the governor said, I want everybody photograph taken. And so May of 1895, he had been in for almost a year, and his hair had grown back, but they hired a local photographer to come into the prison and take his photograph. So down in the corner of that photograph, there's looks like stripes there. Does anybody know what that would be? Striped pants, yeah, exactly. So he's got his legs crossed there. These, kind of like Dan is right here in the front. And some people say he kind of has a smirk on his face, but I don't know. Anyway, a few years ago, I was up in the state archives, and they actually got the original glass plate out of the mugshot to show me, which I thought was pretty cool. Anyway, so during these two trials, the judge that had overseen the trials was named Jesse Knight. And it's interesting, Jesse Knight, before Butch's 2 years of hard labor were up, he writes to the governor of Wyoming, Governor Richards, and says, this George Cassidy seems to be a man of great influence on the local cowboys. And I think it would be a good idea if you could pardon him early so he would leave with a good taste in his mouth and maybe influence the other cowboys for good. And so the governor says, well, I'll do that only if there's a petition signed and his good behavior is guaranteed by these individuals. And so this is a copy of that petition that was sent around, and you can see that Butch had some pretty prominent friends. The sheriff of Fremont County, the mayor, there's a state senator. All these people signed the petition for his early release. And of course, from history, we know that he did not intend to be a law-abiding citizen. He actually told his family later on that if they're going to label me an outlaw, I'm going to show them what a real outlaw is. And that's really when he became and he had robbed a bank in Telluride, but when we all need money, it's, we try to take a loan out, right? So it's, come on. Anyway, it's interesting that when he did have his two trials for the horse theft, they never did make the connection to Telluride. Again, he'd gone to another state, changed his name, and they never had made that connection. So the Governor Richards does pardon him about 6 months early for good behavior. He was a model prisoner, didn't cause any trouble. And so he's released January of 1896. All right, so are we all still here? Haven't fallen asleep? All right. Okay, so 1896, he's got a clean slate. He can go and do anything he wants and, make his mark in the world. But what does Butch do? Doesn't make a great decision. But his good friend, if you remember, Matt Warner, who had helped him rob the bank in Telluride, he's married, and his wife is harping on him to stop the outlaw life and to be a model citizen. So he hires down in Vernal, hires to protect some gold mining claims, which is kind of right with this whole crowd, right? And so according to Matt, they go up Dry Fork Canyon and they're ambushed, and he ends up killing 2 of the people that ambushed him. Now this is his side of the story. I'm sure there's another side that, he came in with these guns blazing. But according to Matt, he turned himself in to the sheriff there in Vernal, and the sheriff, I believe, was Sheriff Pope, and he was quite a. I worked with. I've been working in the oil and gas for 30 years, and I worked with his great-great-grandson. I said, what was he like? And they said, he was an ornery bastard, and we were glad to see him finally go. So anyway, I think that the good lawmen, there was a fine line between outlaws and lawmen. I mean, for example, Frank Canton up in Wyoming that became a U.S. Marshal, he was an outlaw in Texas, Joe Horner, and actually killed somebody. was on trial and escaped jail and went to Wyoming, became a U.S. Marshal. So there you go. Anyway, he turns him in. The sheriff's worried that because the two people that were killed were pretty well liked in the community, he's worried that they're going to break into the jail and lynch Matt Warner and the other guy that's with him named Bill Wall. And so he decides to take them to Ogden to a more secure facility. And so Matt says that they put them on mules, tied their legs underneath the mule, and he said they wouldn't let them off to relieve themselves during the trip. And he swore that someday he was going to kill him for that treatment, but he never did. But anyway, so they go over to Ogden. Butch and some of the boys went to the mouth of Weber Canyon and camped and got word into Matt and said, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to break you out or what? And so Matt sends word back that no, hire some good lawyers and see if you can get me off. And so Butch, being fresh out of prison, you know, this is 8 months of being out of prison, he's flat broke. So what does he do? He goes, makes a withdrawal from a bank, right? So he goes to Evanston to kind of case the bank there, and he's spotted, and they actually mentioned that he was in town, and he just scraps that idea. He goes to Logan and kind of cases the bank out there and decides against it, and then goes to Montpelier, Idaho, and decides that bank is nice and juicy and ready for withdrawal. So him and his best friend was named William Ellsworth Lay, or Elsie Lay was his nickname. It wasn't the Sundance Kid, as Hollywood would have you believe. But Butch and Elsie and another Mormon cowboy from Lyman area named Bub Meeks go in and rob the bank there at Montpelier. They get jobs at a local ranch for 2 weeks, and it was actually owned by the jeweler in town, and he's working in town, and his wife's kind of running the ranch. And she mentioned that, yeah, they would, on rainy days when they couldn't work, they'd go off heavily mounted with arms and go off and practice shooting and whatnot. But anyway, they go and case the bank. They rob the bank August 13th, 1896. And I've heard stories that it was the 13th hour or something, and there was like the last $13 was put in. Anyway, this unlucky 13 being Friday the 13th or something. But anyway, they robbed the bank and head towards Wyoming. The sheriff, they made fun of him, Cruikshank, I think was his name, because he grabbed a bicycle and was chasing them out of town on their horses. And I think the reason that was the closest thing he could find, and he just wanted to see what direction they went so they could chase them with the posse. But one of the things that Butch perfected, and I've always, growing up, had heard that he was a great judge of horse flesh, and which he had to be, and you had to have the best horses, and he perfected the idea of having fresh relays so that they could outdistance the posse about every 10 miles, to where they could, within a couple relays, the posse's horses be winded and they'd have fresh horses to be able to elude the posse. And that's what they did as they headed towards to Wyoming. So that winter, Butch and Elsie spend the winter down in Robber's Roost, and they bring in Elsie Lay married a girl from the Vernal area named Maud Davis, and there was Maud Davis said that the other woman that was with Butch was at a place. Now I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what she said in her writings. So anyway, that winter they spent it in Robber's Roost, and they planned to rob the payroll robbery in Castlegate, which is just north of Price, Utah, the next spring. And so if you've been down Price Canyon, it's a pretty narrow canyon, and so they spent some time training their horses. They'd come in and make sure that they weren't spooked by the steam that came from the engines and that. But the payroll, they never knew when it was coming for sure. It would come at different times from Salt Lake on the train, and so they had to be ready for that. And they said that they were both kind of dressed up as bums, and I wish I had a picture of the payroll office, but it was up on the second floor, and they said that Butch sat down at the base of the stairs that went up to the second floor to the offices, and then Elsie was on his horse. And so when they brought the bags of gold for the payroll over from the train to go up the stairs, Butch pulled out his Colt revolver and said, "I'll take those," and tossed them up to Elsie. And apparently Butch's horse kind of got free at that moment, and I would imagine the adrenaline rush for that would be kind of nervous, because I mean, it's payday, there's probably people standing around with guns and whatnot, but they said it was so well executed and it happened so quickly that a lot of people didn't know what had happened. But so they were able to take off. They actually said that they chased them a little bit with the steam engine to kind of see where they were going. I think they hid behind some buildings, and then they had a set of relays just at Spring Creek, which is just a little bit ways from south of Castlegate. But anyway, they were able to elude the posse and successfully get away. But the result of the Castlegate robbery was it got a lot of press because it was a daring daylight robbery, and so they were front page news across the U.S. And the thing that Butch would do to kind of blend in is he would go and hire out with the local ranch, because he had grown up being a cowboy. He knew how to work, and so they worked their way down into Arizona and then eventually to Alma, New Mexico, and got jobs with the WS Ranch, which was a big ranch there. And he said that Elsie Lay was really good with horses. He broke horses, and Butch, they really liked him because he seemed to have this endless supply of men that could come in and work. And for some reason, the rustling from the other area stopped when the outlaws were in charge of the ranch. And so they actually wanted to hire Butch as foreman of the ranch. And finally he admitted who he was and said, I can't become your foreman because it would cause you nothing but trouble. So he decides to, they spent about 2 years down on the WS Ranch. During that time, there was well, here's a picture of the ranch that looks like today. During that time, there is a train robbery in Wyoming, near Wilcox, Wyoming, in 1899. Hey, there you go. Did you hear that? That was just like in the movie, they used too much dynamite and destroyed the express car. So if you remember or I don't know if I explained it very well, but when Butch was pardoned, he made a promise to the governor of Wyoming that he wouldn't turn a trick in the state of Wyoming. And this train robbery's in Wyoming. So what the heck, you know? I think what happened was, and this is my theory, I don't think Butch was physically at the robbery. He helped plan it. But in his mind, if he wasn't physically there as one of the bandits, then he was keeping his promise to the governor. So, I don't know. So anyway, yeah, just like I say in the movie, they destroyed the express car and they got away. And that's a fun, I've gone with some guys and we kind of retraced the escape route and whatnot. That was pretty fun. So, and then this is a picture of the posse. I love this picture because it looks like they just got out of Sunday school. They got their ties on and they don't look like they're ready to hit the trail. I think this was maybe a promo for the super posse that they had assembled. And if you remember the movie Joe LaForge with the white skimmer, he's actually number 3 there with the posse. And Joe wrote a book later on, but he never did. He chased the wild bunch, but they never caught him. So anyway, during this time, it's about the turn of the century, There is some evidence that Butch explored the idea of, if I turn myself in, can I obtain amnesty? If I put my outlaw ways behind me, can I get amnesty? So he meets with Orlando Powers, an attorney in Salt Lake City. He was the lead attorney in Matt Warner's defense. He was also a prosecuting attorney for a lot of the Mormon polygamy cases and whatnot. Orlando Powers doesn't give Butch any encouragement. He says, if you obtain amnesty in Utah, you're just going to be extradited by Colorado or Wyoming because you've committed robberies in all these different states. So then there's, of course, with Butch, there's lots of folklore, lots of stories. There's stories that he met with the governor of Utah, Heber Wells, and I think that's all it is, those stories. I don't think the governor ever met with Butch Cassidy. In my mind, I don't believe that, but there was certainly some concern about the outlaws, and he issued a list of warrants, and Butch was at the top of that list at the time. So during this time, Butch is looking at a way, I'm getting tired of being chased, I'm always looking over my shoulder. Of course, if he'd stop robbing, that might help, but anyway. He finally hatches the idea that he's going to move physically to the other side of the world and become a law-abiding citizen. And that's when the idea of going to Argentina was hatched. And it was really, at the time, was the land of opportunity. The National Geographic, a lot of publications were touting that you could go down there and obtain cheap land, and it was very comparable in climate to the West and that, and so he makes plans to go to Argentina. And in order to do that, you got to build up your nest egg, though, right, before you go. So he plans a couple more robberies. So he goes back to Wyoming, and they plan the Tipton train robbery. Now, again, I think Butch planned it, helped with the planning of it, but wasn't physically there, because he was 3 weeks later, there was a bank robbery in Winnemucca, Nevada, and he, I believe, was physically there for that. So I think this was coordinated with Kid Curry, Harvey Logan, and that occurs on August 29th, 1900. And as I mentioned, 3 weeks later, in September of 1900, they robbed the Winnemucca Bank of $35,000 in gold. And this really is Butch's last U.S. robbery. At this point, they meet down in Fort Worth, Texas, and have their famous photograph taken. Some people call it the Fort Worth Five. And I don't know if everybody knows where Butch is at. Of course, he's over on the right-hand side, sitting down. Sundance Kid is over on the left-hand side. So to give you some backstory, so when Butch and Elsie were down on the WS, Elsie decides that he's going to go off with the Ketchum gang and rob a train. He might be getting bored, or he needs a little adrenaline rush. Butch tries to dissuade him from doing that, but he goes anyway. They rob the train near Folsom, New Mexico, of nearly $100,000. The gang is in Turkey Creek Canyon, which is on the Philmont Scout Ranch, and they were ambushed by the posse. And Elsie is wounded. He has actually a shot that goes completely through his torso, but he's still able to ride out and get away. And really, the reason the outlaws had the advantage, and even though they were ambushed, was they had smokeless powder. That was a new technology at the time, and the lawmen were still using the black powder that let off a big. So as the outlaws were hiding in that canyon, they could elude them, and when a big puff of smoke had come out, they knew exactly where the lawmen were at. And so they actually killed 2 different lawmen and were able to get out of there. Now, Sam Ketchum later dies from his wounds, and Elsie rides 300 miles with that wound through his torso, and he goes in to get supplies, and the guy that he thought he could trust turned him in, and so he's captured. He's tried for train robbery and given a life sentence in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So he's not available to go to South America. And so that's when, what'd they do? That's when Sundance really becomes Butch's closest confidant, and he's the one that goes with him to South America. And then, of course, Sundance has a famous girlfriend named Etta Place that goes with them, and they pose as Butch poses as her brother. James Ryan is the name he uses, and the Sundance Kid, his real name is Harry Alonzo Longabaugh. He goes by Harry Place, which was his mother's maiden name, and then that's where Etta Place comes from. So they go to New York City and kind of live it up like in the movie. And the Pinkertons later find out that they were there, and they're quite upset because the Pinkertons' headquarters is New York City, and there they were playing around right under their noses, and they don't know it. But they take a steamer in February 1901 from New York to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and they actually make a deposit at a bank in Argentina and deposit their money. They go and meet with the American consulate and decide where they could go to settle some land. He tells them to go to the Patagonia area, and so they make that journey from Buenos Aires to Patagonia. Now in 2007, I had the opportunity to go down and see the ranch, and the climate and whatnot is very much like home for Butch, and dry climate like the West. And this is a picture of the ranch that they established, and it was at the base of the Andes. It's still, the cabin and whatnot is still standing, and it's actually been restored as a little historic site. And anyway, they live in relative peace for about 4 years on this ranch. They're well liked. Butch, being the charismatic person he is, there's a lot of new immigrants coming in from across the Andes from Chile, and he teaches them how to be ranchers and farmers and whatnot. So he's well liked in the community. They said that the governor of the area, when he came, because it's a remote area, would actually stay at their ranch, and they said that he liked to dance with Etta Place. So anyway, they're well established, and so I don't know, maybe 4 years of not having the adrenaline rush of robbing a bank or what, somehow they decide, they have a couple friends, and they tell them, they says, if you were to rob a bank, this is what I'd do, or this is how you do it. And so there's actually a bank robbery in Rio Gallegos, which is about 700 miles away from their ranch in Patagonia, Argentina. Now, in the meantime, the Pinkertons, Sundance had been writing to his sister Samantha in Pennsylvania. Well, they had been intercepting the mail and reading the mail, trying to figure out where they were at. So they sent an agent down to Argentina to confirm that it is Butch and Sundance. He's able to confirm that. So they go and visit with the banks and railroads and say, well, we found these two. Will you fund us to go down and capture them and bring them back? And they're like, oh, they're out of our hair. We're not spending another dime on these guys. Let them be. So what they do as a result is they generate a bunch of wanted posters in Spanish and notify the local authorities if there's ever a bank robbery or any trouble, these two notorious outlaws are likely responsible. So with that Rio Gallegos bank robbery, even though they weren't the two doing it, the two that did it were their friends, but they're going to be questioned. They're going to be arrested and questioned about the robbery. And because they're well established in the community, they're actually friends with the chief of police. And he actually tips them off. I don't know if you can see this picture very well. This is a picture of the ranch in Patagonia, and Butch is clear over on the left-hand side, and Sundance and Etta are on the right-hand side. In the center there, it's hard for me to even see it, there's a couple, George and Ethel Hammond, that were their good friends. Now, Ethel Hammond's brother is the chief of police. But in 2007, when I went down, their great-grandson, Reggie Hammond, was my sponsor that I was able to coordinate the trip with. And he has since passed away, but that was kind of fun. Anyway, so they're going to be questioned about the robbery. Oh, here's a famous photograph. So apparently Sundance sent this photograph back to his sister Samantha, but it wasn't a very clear photograph. But just recently we were able to find a higher resolution photograph, and you can actually see, they call this a tea party photo because it looks like Ed is serving tea to Sundance and Butch. But you can tell the detail. Butch actually has a Montana Peak hat on his lap. You can actually see the cigarette in his hand there, and then there's a couple dogs there. But anyway, that's a pretty neat photograph. Here's a picture of the cabin, what it looks like today. And this is the Rio Gallegos Bank that's robbed. So they get wind that they're going to be questioned, so they sell off their property, they escape into Chile, and eventually work their way north into Bolivia, southern Bolivia. And this is when there was a payroll robbery near San Vicente, Bolivia, and by two gringos, and the two outlaws go and stay in the town, and they see the mule has the brand from the tin mine that's robbed, the payroll that's robbed from, and so they determine it. And so there's a gun battle between the two outlaws and the local police, and they're wounded. And during the night, I guess the police decide they're going to storm them the next morning, but they're going to wait. And during the night, they hear two shots. The next morning, the two outlaws are dead, found dead. And of course, the story is told that it was Butch and Sundance. Now, why they were down there, they became friends with an American mining engineer named Percy Siebert, and they would go to his house and have Sunday dinner with him, with his family. And Percy said that Butch would tell him about how, he couldn't put his outlaw ways behind him. They think they'd settle down, and then pretty soon the law was coming from him. And so Percy Siebert was the one that suggested that the two dead outlaws was Butch and Sundance. Although they were never positively identified, nobody went and identified the bodies. So the two outlaws were buried as unknown and buried in the cemetery there in Bolivia. But the story goes on that it's Butch and Sundance. Let's see. So I don't know if you remember, PBS Nova did a series on exhuming the graves, and I think it was 1992. And they had Clyde Snow, that was a famous forensic scientist. They went down, they exhumed what they thought were the graves, and the two skeletal remains that they exhumed matched the story. There was one of the outlaws had a wound in his forehead, one had his wound in the temple. The story was Butch shot Sundance. They were both wounded, so he shot Sundance in the forehead and then put the gun to his temple, and it was a murder-suicide. And the skeletal remains matched that. So they were 99% sure they had the right grave. And so they did DNA testing against family, came back as negative. It was neither Butch or Sundance. So then they said, well, we just dug up the wrong graves. But it's interesting that they were 99% sure they had the right graves before they had the DNA evidence. But I personally think that they did find the two outlaws that robbed the payroll. It just wasn't who they wanted it to be, Butch and Sundance. So Lula said that Butch showed up in Circleville 1925 to come and visit the family, and spent about 2 weeks with the family. He explained that he got separated for Sundance. He didn't know what had happened to him, and he had made his way separately back to the U.S. He had actually had got bitten by something and was sick during that time when the gun battle was happening, so he didn't know anything about it, and had made his way back to the U.S. You know, kind of like different theories, there's debate that will probably go on for time, that some people are in the camp that they were killed in South America. Some believe that he came back, and there's not conclusive evidence either way. So you kind of just have to review the evidence and decide for yourself. But just by a show of hands, who believes that they made their way back? I like this crowd. Well, that's certainly what I believe. I support Lula. You know, I've spent probably 30, 40 years researching, and I haven't come across anything to dissuade me from that. But there was a lot of eyewitness accounts in Wyoming and even southern Utah of him being back after the gun battle. But that kind of concludes my presentation. So.
Where's the goal?
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it.
Oh, you want this back?
Joe, thank you.
Has anybody got any questions for Bill while he's here?
Where's the gold? All right. Yeah, so are there any questions that anybody wants to, I mean, I'll do the breakout so we can get into more details, but is there any quick questions anybody wants to ask? Yes, right here.
Tell them the one where I asked you the other day if the Pinkertons kind of went into Centerville and was kind of scoping out the Parker house.
Oh, so yeah, so Mark, his question was about the Pinkertons going into Circleville and, you know, scoping out the family like they did with Sundance and his sister and that. And, you know, that's really interesting because Charlie Siringo, who was a very famous Pinkerton detective, talks about that specifically in one of his books. And he talks about falling in love with one of Butch's sisters, who was the postmistress at the time. And that was my great-grandma! That was Lula. She worked at the post office, and so I was like, wow, that's kind of cool. So anyway, they certainly had come through that area and were working undercover trying to get information on where they were at. So that's a good question. Any other questions? Where he's buried, or where's the loot? Yes, right there in the blue.
I'm wondering about Hiram Beebe.
Hiram Beebe. So Hiram Beebe, I think you had Dr. Steve Lacey here in the past. He's a firm believer that Hiram Beebe is the Sundance Kid. Now, Hiram Beebe is buried in the Salt Lake Cemetery and was in the Utah State Pen. And there's stories that he was writing to the Longabaugh family and that he was Sundance in later life. I personally don't believe that. I think there's too many discrepancies. He was a much shorter man than Sundance, and by a foot or so, and the Longabaugh family that is the most vocal says that he wasn't a member of their family. So I don't know, but that's certainly one of there's definitely lots of stories out there. There was, if you remember, a few years ago they exhumed a grave in Duchesne that was Henry Long, that they thought was the Sundance Kid. I think they've finally decided that wasn't. I think Henry Long was a fringe member of the gang, but I don't think he was the Sundance Kid. So a little bit louder, sorry.
So in the 70s, I was living in Spring City at the time, and they were talking about Hiram on Hiram Beebe.
Yes.
That's where I was.
Yeah, so he was living in Spring City, and I think he killed the marshal, and that's why he went to the penitentiary or something. And yeah, there was also another guy in the 70s that was claiming to be the son of the Sundance Kid, and he did a number of presentations and talks around the area, and then he was later killed in a hotel fire up in Montana. But I've heard recently that somebody has some of his writings in that, so I mean, I try to keep an open mind to everything, but and that's one thing I try to do when there's so much myth and folklore associated with Butch and Sundance and whatnot, that when I tried to do my book, I tried to document as much as I could. If I didn't have something that was, you know, solid, I tried to clarify that, and I tried to make it as, you know, true as I could. So anyway, yes.
There's theories on where Butch is buried, and has anyone ever done DNA testing on that grave?
So yeah, so different graves for Butch Cassidy. So yeah, or did you have a specific one in mind, or? So yeah, there's a number of theories there. There's a lady down in St. George that's been involved, and she thinks he's buried in Circleville area, and she actually did some digging up on Circleville Mountain, and they haven't found anything as far as I'm aware. But Lula did not want her brother's remains disturbed, and so when he came back, the father Maximilian made the family members that were there do a family pact that they wouldn't talk about his visit, and when he died, they didn't want to reveal anything. They wanted to go along with the stories that he'd been killed in South America so he could be left alone. In the 70s, the Price Cemetery had expanded, and they used to bury the outlaws outside of the cemetery boundaries. Well, it had expanded, and it encompassed some of the outlaws, and they exhumed the graves, and they had pictures in the newspaper, and Lula saw those, and she was just mortified. She thought that was horrible that they would disturb a grave like that. So she said, if I tell where he's buried, they're going to exhume the graves. And Dan Buck in Washington, D.C., that was involved in the exhuming the graves in San Vicente, said, exactly, that's exactly what I'd do. So the family doesn't want his grave disturbed, and so they've been very quiet about that. And I think I even got a note the other day from somebody on Facebook that supposedly has permission from the Parker family, which I disagree with, and they're exhuming some grave, which I don't even know where it's at, but lots of theories out there. So, but I'd love to talk to you during the breakout tomorrow, so thank you.
Same here, Bill.
Okay.
Dave Jakes has made a little trophy plaque thing, and we wanted to give it to Bill for speaking with us tonight, and we really appreciate him.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Oh.